Now to this CBS News clip where Obama gave some very interesting comments today regarding ISIS. He basically acknowledged that the growth of ISIS in Syria and Iraq came about as a result of the destabilization of Syria, which of course was a direct result of the US arming the moderate rebels against the Assad government. Obama didn't admit that in his quote, but he certainly went kind of a limited hangout some part of the way to acknowledging that situation. So here's the clip from CBS News.
End up where they are in control of so much territory. Was that a complete surprise to you?
Well, I think our head of the intelligence community, Jim Clapper, has acknowledged that I think they underestimated what had been taking place in Syria.
Obama is basically acknowledging that with the rise of jihadists, destabilization in Syria, of course in Libya as well, that's where terrorists thrive. But of course we know in Libya, they armed the jihadists. I mean, look at Libya now. It's a complete failed state. Drug lords, gangs of terrorist militants are running the country. You know, black people are locked up in concentration camps as a direct result of US airstrikes on Libya in 2011. We're seeing that same process again unfolding in Syria. So, you know, they destabilized the governments of Assad, of Gaddafi, the secular, mainly moderate, of course. They were proxy dictatorships in a sense, but there were no mass terrorist attacks, destabilization campaigns in Libya, in Syria, before the United States, the United Kingdom, and the NATO countries started arming these jihadist rebels. So Obama talks about, quote, jihadist nonsense in this CBS interview. They funded, they bankrolled, they armed the jihadist nonsense to begin with. The terrorists from Libya crossed into Syria to start that destabilization campaign. So I thought that it was interesting that, you know, he goes some way to acknowledging that the primary cause of the growth of ISIS was the destabilization of these countries without admitting to the fact that it was the United States foreign policy in alignment with NATO, which was a deliberate attempt to create that destabilization in the first place, which of course led to Syria, led to the growth of ISIS, led to Benghazi, and basically this jihadist control over the region. David Knight.
I thought it was interesting that he's talking about jihadists from around the world. Just as I had mentioned, they were trying to sell the narrative about a month ago that there were 300 Americans that had gone over there to fight. Turns out it's not even that. Now they're admitting the FBI is saying maybe 12. That's hardly an international movement that we need to be concerned about. But it really shows, just look at the last couple of years. As we've been pointing out, the fake sarin gas attacks that they had a year ago, trying to lay that solely on the Syrian administration. And then earlier than that, there had been some other sarin gas attacks. And you had, after we were pointing out that there were reports that it was done by the Saudis, or reports that it was not from Assad, and there were reports that back earlier in the spring, it had been a homegrown sarin gas. And of course, they were trying to sell the narrative that only the Assad regime could have sarin gas. And at that point, you had even the American military join with UN inspectors and with Russian inspectors and saying, yeah, they do have the capability to do sarin gas. So that whole thing fizzled away, but they've looked for every kind of excuse they can to provoke an involvement of American forces in Syria, because their ultimate goal, as we've been told for a long time, is to take down the Syrian regime. That's one of the regimes on the list to be taken down. And
that's what the Saudi prince, Wesley Clark, the 7 countries to be taken down in the aftermath of 9/11, that's what the Saudi prince admitted earlier. The ultimate agenda behind targeting ISIS is to affect regime change in Syria, so that's now an open secret. We're going to switch now in the last 4 or 5 minutes in this segment to this foreign affairs piece, which of course is the publication of the CFR. It's the conversations that the elite are having with each other. You can see it here, the American distemper when polarization confronts the United States Madisonian check and balance political system. The result is devastating. And what this article is about, it's a 9-10 page article, amidst a selection of other articles. It's basically almost half of the magazine for this September-October edition, is about the blind panic that the elite finds itself in as a result of the growth of the distemper, as they call it, the populist uprising. There you see it on the CFR website, America in Decay, the sources of political dysfunction. And it's talking about how they need to, here's a quote directly from the article, leaders must learn to co-opt, that's the key phrase, and channel popular passions, addressing political outsiders' legitimate grievances while bypassing their simplistic solutions. So they admit that this populist uprising, which mainly focuses on the decline in living standards in both the United States and Europe over the past 25 years, and the crisis in national identity as a result of mass immigration, it's a genuine issue. It's a legitimate concern that many people have. But what their solution to it is not to actually address the problem itself, but to hijack, to co-opt those populist uprisings endemic within the Tea Party, the UK Independence Party in the United Kingdom, and numerous other parties throughout Europe, the True Finn Party in Finland, Marine Le Pen in France, and several others. They need to hijack that. They need to divert it into separate channels so it gets shut down, so it gets closeted away, so nobody actually faces up to the problem. And it's amazing that they're admitting this. David Knight, how does this tie into what you've been researching earlier? We mentioned Catalonia and the wave of populist rebellion against the establishment system throughout Europe and the US.
Oh, yeah. A lot of small countries are wanting to basically take back their self-governance. We see this happening throughout Europe. There's pockets of it happening in America. We see dissatisfaction out in California, for example. Some of the counties there want to secede from the state of California because they have a different view of a lot of different issues, whether it's gun control or other issues. So this is something that is definitely happening, but we all need to remember that this is really kind of what they're talking about here is essentially like the COINTEL programs that we've seen in the past, where they go in and they take over any and every movement. They may come in and have some people who try to turn it into a violent movement. If it's a peaceful movement, they may come in and actually provoke things as agent provocateurs. We've seen that happen over and over again in the past. Or they may do what David Cameron did earlier, and that is they just come in and say, we're going to resort to outright censorship. We're going to shut you down that way. So they don't ever put all their eggs in one basket. They don't count on being able to completely shut people down. They want to also be able to covertly take over these movements, make them look bad, or completely take over the leadership of them.
In the past decade, we have witnessed unparalleled scientific discoveries in the area of health. But no one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. DNA Force is one of the most expensive formulas to produce. Some of the ingredients in DNA Force are $12,000 a kilogram. We are using the coveted, patented, only American source of PQQ, CoQ10, and more. You want the best that's out there at the lowest price anywhere? Well, we're bringing you a total win-win. The ultimate value, cutting-edge, trailblazing game changer that also supports the InfoWar. We have produced a limited run of DNA Force, and it will take up to 12 weeks to produce more once we sell out. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139. DNA Force from InfoWars Life.
But for the moment, we're talking about this Foreign Affairs article, which is, of course, the CFR's publication. Basically, the CFR runs the State Department in the United States, as Hillary Clinton admitted. And they're talking about the populist uprising, both in America and throughout Europe. And this is interesting. I mean, I highlighted several passages of the article earlier today. Here's a quote. "And yet, when most Westerners hear the word democracy today, what they picture is a political atmosphere that is respectful, predictable, and a little staid, a system in which a small number of long-standing political parties alternate in government on a semi-regular basis, resulting in reasonably moderate changes to public policy." So basically, that is the CFR admitting their agenda to keep the two-party monopoly in place, both in the United States with the Republicans and the Democrats, and in the UK with the Tories and the Labour Party. The threat to that system in the UK is the UK Independence Party, and of course the Tea Party sentiment rising in some factions of the Republican Party in the United States. And basically in this article, they admit that, I mean, here's another quote. This you really need to get a hold of this if you can get your hands on the magazine. Quote, "To harness the passion of the populace to the cause of reinvigorating governance, but without helping them kindle the flames of an anti-democratic revolt." So they're admitting they need to harness the power of the populist uprising to reinforce the power of the state, which of course runs completely opposite to the goal of this populist uprising, which is to work towards smaller government, towards anti-statist objectives. So the fact that they're talking about, you know, co-opting this movement to increase the power of the state, and later they talk about wealth redistribution, is absolutely amazing that it's so brazen in the CFR's own publication. David Knight, your comments on this?
We've already seen that, Paul. We've seen it with both the Tea Party as well as with the Occupy movement, that both of the mainstream political parties have moved in to co-opt those movements, to take them over. They're born out of frustration, fundamentally, both of them, with the banking system and the abuses of the central banks and the very large, powerful banks that are too big to jail, as Eric Holder put it. That was the initial movement of the Tea Party, where they came out, by some people's account, 500,000 people went to Washington to protest the banker bailouts. And of course, the left's Occupy movement is also upset about what the bankers are doing. So what they do is both parties try to co-opt that. Both parties try to shut that down. The Republicans don't want to see Tea Party candidates elected. They've got their own mainstream candidates who, very much like the situation in Hong Kong, are vetted by the elitists. China wants to vet any candidate that appears on the ballot in Hong Kong. That's why you've got thousands of students protesting, and that's now turned into a violent protest, whether that was started by agent provocateurs or whether it was started by the police or whether it was just some hotheads, who knows? Because we've seen that happen as well. We've seen agent provocateurs and COINTEL programs. That is essentially what's happening, but very often we don't hear that admitted in America. That's what's unusual about this, is that the CFR, which essentially has controlled the State Department in America since its creation, even though Reagan wasn't a member of the CFR, the first president since its foundation to not be a member, he subsequently appointed 300 people from the CFR into the State Department.
It's amazing. We're going to get more into this after the break. We're going to take your calls. John Rappaport is coming up to talk about Ebola and the CDC whistleblower. This is the Alex Jones Show live, Infowars.com. Stay tuned.